Over to you, Beth.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to share the screen so you can see my slides. And there we go. Hopefully we can all see that. I'll let Linda come and chat if you can't see it and let me know. Otherwise, I'll assume we can all see. Okay, so what I'm going to do today, hopefully, if I can get the slideshow to start, is to give a brief introduction to the history of manors. This is obviously quite a large topic and we're a little limited by the amount of time we've got. So what I'll do is give you that sort of introductory talk that'll hopefully give you those sort of early bits of knowledge to sort of move on with your manorial research. Towards the latter part of the talk, I'm also going to focus on manorial documents. So I'm going to highlight some different types of manorial documents. I'm going to use some examples, and throughout that, I'll give you some ideas of the sort of information you can pull from those, and hopefully again give you those early tools so that you can move on to some manorial research, regardless of your background. And then at the end of the talk, because obviously again we're quite limited, so I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but I am going to highlight some websites and some books that you could use, which will then help you move on to the next steps. And again, if you have any questions throughout, if you just pop them in a chat, and I'm happy to answer them at the end. I don't know if I can minimize that. Okay. So to begin with, when I talk about the term manor, so it's a term that starts to appear shortly before Doomsday, so shortly before 1066. And the main thing really to remember when you're thinking about what a manor is to just think of it as a single administrative unit of landed estate that does not require a manor house. So again, I know that you're all coming to this with sort of different backgrounds and knowledge, but if you have no other knowledge of a manor, it might be that you think of the big grand house, and maybe you think of a set size or shape of land, something like a town. It really doesn't have any kind of a constant. What we can say is that they're originally held of the king, so you may see it referred to like that, a manor, certainly in the Doomsday Book, by a single landlord or lady, known as Lord or Lady of the Manor. You may also see the terms honour, barony or lordship appear. That's where one lord could own multiple manors. So as I've just mentioned before, there's no set format for a manor. We could have a manor that consists of an entire village. We could have one village that has multiple manors in it. We could also have multiple patches of land that consist of one manor. The only thing that we can say is constant, as I mentioned before, is it's a single administrative unit. So that manor would have their own laws and customs. And again, even when thinking about how that land is governed, I'll go into this a little bit more, but we may have land that's entirely full of tenants, or we may have land that doesn't have any tenants at all. I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. When you're starting your manorial research, you may find that some manorial records appear within estate records or estate collections as well. They are separate. The main difference between the two is the manor court. So manors had the right to hold a court, while estates didn't. The reason they may appear in estate collections, manorial records, is that owners of landed estate could also themselves own manors. So they'd need to hold those records to prove their rights to that ownership. So if you're sort of new to the research and you find this crossover, just remember that they are separate, but you may find the records in each of those collections. So I'm going to talk through a little bit of the sort of management of different types of manors. I'll start with early medieval, and then I'll move on a little bit to some of the later. But again, I am going to highlight some books towards the end that can help you to research this a bit further, because I'll be flying through a little bit. We may find with small manors in the early medieval period that they're managed entirely by one landowner. So the land may contain only domain lands or lands held by local tenants. When I talk about domain lands, that's the land that is directly under the control of a landlord. So there's no middle or main tenant. So basically the lord himself is taking the profit from that land rather than having tenants on there. Around the same time, if we're thinking about large manors, a lord could employ a bailiff to run the property, and this is quite common because it may be quite a large bit of land. Usually they might let out the manor as well for a predetermined annual rent or some produce. So these are all things that you may be able to find on some of the documents. And you find that most land was held like this at Doomsday and for the next 100 years at least. As we move towards the 12th to 14th century, domain farming becomes a lot more popular. So basically this is where the Lord appoints a manor official. Early on, we have quite a clear hierarchy with this. These terms or sort of titles I'm about to talk you through in a moment do continue throughout, but the sort of hierarchy, the strong hierarchy is most common between the 12th and the 14th century. So at the bottom of the hierarchy, we have the reeve. You may see the reeve mentioned in records, and I think we see him a little bit later on. At this point, the reeve is a tenant chosen by the Lord or his fellow tenants to till the domain lands and manage the livestock. So basically they're on the ground level. They're looking after the land at that level. Next up on the hierarchy, we'd have the bailiff, and they may be brought in to manage 2 or 3 manors. So we're talking about large manors.
Join the meeting.
We could have multiple manors within that. So a bailiff would manage 2 or 3 manors. A steward would then be above the bailiff, so continuing up to manage the whole estate. So say there's 6 manors, we'd have 2 bailiffs and a steward above there. The auditor, we can think of pretty similarly to how we think of an auditor today. They were there to keep an eye on the official accounts. And then right at the top, we have the lord of the manor. Again, lord or lady, I'm just going to say lord because it's easier. Eventually, we see this sort of firm hierarchy fading, but the terms remain. We just have to bear in mind that the duties change a little bit. So the steward does remain, and you will see him coming up on manorial records. But we start to find that over time, their duties seem to relate mostly to manorial courts. And you'll usually see on court rolls, again, which I'll highlight a bit later on, that the steward is mentioned as holding the courts. The auditors keep their duties and the officials also keep their duties. What we find with the officials is that around this point, you tend to get either a reeve or a bailiff. A reeve now would be referred to as a local unfree tenant. I'll talk about the types of tenancy in a moment, but a local unfree tenant who would receive no payment beyond
Join the meeting.
claims, or a bailiff. So a bailiff would be an individual at this point who'd be brought into the manor to do that management, and they would get a stipend. You may find either of these referred to as a servience or a sergeant or a servant, but effectively an official would be a reeve or a bailiff. So a reeve, no payment as part of their tenancy agreement. A bailiff would get a stipend. Basically, because the bailiff could get a stipend, they could almost become like a lessee. They could almost start to take some profit from the manor, depending on how they went about that management, because it sort of depends on the sort of stipend they have, but there is some money to be made for them out of taking on those duties. It's also worth bearing in mind that by 1400 leasing of the land is quite popular. I think I've mentioned that briefly already, but it's just worth bearing in mind that the Lord might lease out the manors. In terms of the manorial documents, just bear in mind with this that the manorial courts always remain in the hands of the manor lord, and that the steward's duties remain the same. So it might not be overly clear from the manorial records that the land's been leased, depending on the records you're looking at. And we find this format, so that previous format of the reeve and the steward continues through the 14th to the mid-16th century with the dissolution of the monasteries. It's really by around early 1500 that we find the manor court defining the manor. So I've talked about this a little bit earlier on, but each manor had their own customs, their own rules, to govern the behaviour of the tenants within there. So again, regardless of the shape or size of the manor, or if it's patched around, if that manor is a single administrative unit, they would have their own customs. And that's why we see the manor court as defining the manor. That's really the defining point. So I mentioned manorial tenure already. I mentioned unfree tenants. I just thought it would be helpful for me to explain a little bit more about the different sorts of tenants that we come across in manorial records. And we've got a nice example on the left, which I'll come to in a moment, but that's a free tenant list. So with early manorial tenure, so thinking about the early medieval, we tend to get 2 main types and a 3rd type of tenant. So we have freeholders, so freeholder tenants, you may see mentioned. These held the land from the Lord for payment of cash rent and sometimes light labour. So that's what it refers to when we talk about freeholders. They're mostly independent. Unfree tenants, sometimes referred to as villeins or bondmen. they held their land from the lord and paid rent, but had other obligations. So if you remember before, I mentioned the unfree tenant who was a reeve. That for them is their obligation as part of their tenancy. Unfree tenants had little freedom. They needed permission from the lord for many life decisions. So you may see them having to ask to educate their sons, allowing their daughters to marry. That's known as a merchant. You may also find cotters or boarders mentioned on tenancy lists. These were individuals who held no land intended to be labourers. I'm hoping you can see it's sort of cut off on the edge of my screen, so it's possibly cut off for you as well. But on the left-hand side, we have a free tenant list. The reason I included it here rather than later on is that obviously it matches with tenancy, but also I thought it's quite a nice example of what you can gain from looking just at a tenant list alone when we're thinking about manorial records. Now, obviously, it's quite an early record. I rather helpfully haven't written down the date, but it's a reasonably early record. So we have got a little bit of Latin at the top, and that's cut off a little bit on my screen. But it says liberi tenentes, sorry for my pronunciation, so free tenant. And that's it for the Latin, pretty much. We've got a couple of little lines, little odd words in there, but nothing that I think would be too daunting to you if you're starting out with manorial research. I think with any archival research, my advice is always to start with later documents and work your way back. But even if you end up with something like this, okay, yeah, it's in secretary hand, but the Latin's limited. And what we've got here is a really interesting list of the names of these free tenants. Down the left-hand side, we've got different locations. The Manors, usually named at the top, and I think that is the Manor. It's just been cut off a little bit there. But even with a little bit of training to get that secretary hand in, I think this is hopefully showing that it's quite accessible. On the right-hand side, those little E's refer to essoins. I'll talk about this a bit later on, but basically, if a tenant didn't want to attend court, they could or couldn't attend court, they could pay a small fine called an essoin to basically get them out of attending court. But I'll talk a little bit more about these documents later. And just to highlight at this point that if you are very new to research in general, the National Archives have two very good free courses for paleography and for Latin on their website. So that might be a place to go. Really, that's with any archival research, but certainly if you're wanting to look at early manorial documents, that would be helpful. So this is a document in full on the left. Obviously, I zoomed in on the last one. And I'll just very briefly talk about a slight change in manorial tenure. As we move into the 16th century, we now start to see two main forms of manorial tenure appearing. So we have freehold tenants and customary hold tenants. Not that dissimilar freeholders. They held rent, they held their land for a fixed rent. Tenants were obliged to attend manor courts. They may appear as jurors, so you may see them appearing on jury lists. And they were not subject to the customs of the manor. Customary hold, as should be clear from the title, these tenants were subject to the customs of the manor. They're also sometimes referred to as copyhold tenants, as they hold copyhold land. So copyhold comes from the fact that they held a copy of the court roll, which detailed their admission to the holding. So they are subject to the customs of the manor, and they're a little bit more limited than freeholder tenants. And these are much more common in terms of sort of 16th century onwards customary hold tenants. It's worth also just mentioning briefly tenants at will. You may spot these, they're less common. But basically this is individuals who've built their building, their home, their cottage on wasteland without permission. So they may be allowed to keep that land, but obviously they'll then be charged a rent. So they may be referred to as tenants at will. But these are the main sort of forms of tenancy that you'll spot within manorial records. And again, we can start to learn quite a bit just from the tenant lists alone. So I realise that was a very quick introduction. As I say at the end, I will highlight some books which will allow you to look into the absolutely fascinating history of manors a little bit further than that, but hopefully that's enough to help us talk through some manorial documents for the remainder of the talk. Just to mention that when I talk about manorial documents, I'm going to be using the definition from the Law of Property Act that Linda very kindly mentioned at the beginning. So the Act was formed in 1922, and that effectively saw the end of copyhold land as we know it. So just mentioned copyhold land there. This effectively ended with the 1922 Law of Property Act, and a later amendment of 1924. And there was a little bit of a grace period because obviously all of this administration can't just stop immediately. So we tend to count manorial records up to 1925, the end of 1925. So the definition given in that act or in the amendment is that a manorial document includes court rolls, surveys, maps, terriers, documents and books of every description relating to the boundaries, wastes, customs or courts of the manor. It's a bit of a mouthful. They exclude deeds or other instruments relating to evidencing a title or agreements or draft agreements relating to compensation or any documents which came into place after at the end of 1925. So again, it sort of depends on the sort of research that you're doing as to whether you would also like to view those documents. But for the sake of today's talk, I'm just going to follow the 1922 Law of Property Act's definition. Rather handily, I'm just going to highlight this resource, which was mentioned at the beginning. I did work on a couple of counties, as Linda kindly mentioned. The Manorial Documents Register, this is an online resource. You can access it through the National Archives Discovery. This resource really did come into being following that early 1922 Act. Basically, even though copyhold land ended as we know it, the landowners didn't just lose their land, they still owned it and they still needed to be able to prove their rights to that land. So these documents still needed to be maintained, we needed to look after them, we needed to know where they were. So over time, what was an early ledger has turned into a sort of file of paper slips, which has eventually turned into this online register, which was very recently revised. The last county has just been finished now. Do bear in mind that most counties will be available on the Manorial Documents Register, but Lincolnshire, Cornwall and Durham were the last three to complete. And I can't say for sure that they're all on there now, but they will be soon, if not. So just bear with us on that. Basically, on this database, you can search for any manorial document across England and Wales. Bear in mind that it's just a list that tells you where these documents are found. It's not a digitized image list, but it should be extremely helpful to you, depending on your type of research. If you know the manor you want to look at, you should be able to see from this screenshot, you could search by manor name, parish and county. If you look just underneath the large search section there as well, there's an option to search for manorial documents. So if you're just interested, say, in court rolls, or you've come away from this talk and there's a document that looks really interesting to you, you can search for that there as well. You don't have to have a specific manor in mind, but it'll tell you where all of those documents are and who you need to contact to view them, so which archive to view. So I just wanted to highlight this here before I go on, just in case it's of any interest to you, and especially because the digitisation project has just finished this year, and it coincides with the centenary of the Law of Property Act, which is lovely. So I'm going to talk through now some of the different manorial documents. Again, we're quite limited, so it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through. But what I'm going to try and focus on is the sort of information that you can gain from these documents and a little bit about how they change over time. And again, I'm going to highlight some books and some websites at the end, which should lead you to doing further research in that if you're interested. But hopefully this will give you that starting kick. So I'm going to start out with surveys and accounts. When we're talking about surveys and accounts as a whole, there's just a massive wealth of information that you can gain from these. In general, again, I'll talk you through how these change, because obviously there's different time periods, we might get emphasis on different areas, but we can find lists of the tenants who hold land in the manor, the sort of land that they held, the types of tenure, so the different types of tenure, as I mentioned earlier, so what type of tenant were they, rents, renders, services which the tenant paid, customs, restrictions, field, place names, existence of mines. So you don't have to be massively interested in just history. You could be interested in sort of passive geography, locations. There's all sorts of information you can find in these. And basically what surveys were there for was a document which provided for the lord a written record of the obligations owed to him by his tenants. But within that, they also protected the right of the tenant and the lord. So the lord could see their rights. They could also see what the tenants could also see their own rights, and they could see what the lord's rights were. So it sort of protects everyone in that way. They're really interesting documents. I I do include an example a bit later on, so bear with me on that one. I struggled to find some earlier ones, but you really won't if you actually start doing some research. There's plenty of them about. When we think about very early surveys, they can be quite basic, but I don't think that's a bad thing if you're new to manorial research, because obviously the earlier we get, we're going to be looking at Latin and secretary hand. But early surveys, sometimes referred to as custumals, around the 12th to 13th century, they really focus on the revenue that the lord could make from their tenants. So in these early records, we tend to see more emphasis on the tenants themselves, the land type, rents and labours. We sometimes get a brief recital of the customs. So there can be some interesting information to be pulled from these. As we move towards the 13th century, we see quite a strong period of inflation across the country. So you tend to find that while extents, that's the name of the sort of survey you get around the 13th century, while extents contain similar information, they also start to include more detail relating to the domain land of the manor. So if you remember, that's the land that the lord is taking his profit from. And basically, because there's much more money to be made from food prices, from crops, the lords want to know exactly what they can make. They want to know more accurate information about their lands. So we start to see them become a lot more detailed with this information. You find all items on the manor were described, valued in order, beginning with the manor house, then the domain land, and finally we still get the tenants' rents and services. So you might be able to pull a bit more from this, again, if you start to look into extents. As we move towards the 14th century, the economy shifts again, and we tend to find that now less of a period of inflation. Our surveys start to focus a little bit more on the rents, and these are referred to helpfully as rentals. So again, they become briefer, more focused on the rents the lord could collect. Around this time, you also start to see some quit rents. You may or may not see this term appearing, but if you see quit rents, this refers to labour services that were exchanged for money payment and taken with rent. So again, depending on the sort of archive catalogue that you're looking at, all of these may be referred to as surveys, or they may be referred to by these individual terms. It's just worth bearing in mind. The terms themselves can often help you a little bit to know where the emphasis might be within the survey. We also will see accounts appearing in manorial records. I don't think this will be that dissimilar to your own image of what an account is. So basically, it's your classic charge-discharge balance system. Accounts were collected by the bailiff and the reeve. So if you remember from before, the manor official would collect the accounts. And these are a financial account of farming of the domain land, money paid and received for commodities at the market. So when we talk about the charge, that's the money that the lord is bringing in. So money gathered for rents, profits from the sale of commodities, imposition of fines at the manor court, payments of heriots. I talk about heriots a couple of times through this. Again, I'm not sure what background you're coming from, so I will just explain. When we talk about heriot, that's an item seized on the death of a tenant. Often you find that's something like the best beast or the best horse that may be taken by the lord. So the lord is entitled to that on the death of the tenant. You'll then find the discharges on the account, and that's the outgoings. So purchase of seed for corn sowing, equipment, payment of hired labour, and then at the bottom you get the balance. So what exactly can the lord receive? The manor lord received, so it sounded a bit different to how I meant it to. We may also find receivers' accounts around this time. If you see the term receivers' account, it's not necessarily that different. It's just an individual that was employed to collect the money from all the lord's manors. So if you remember, some lords may just have one manor, just be a manor lord with one manor. Some have lots of manors. They might have a receiver to collect all of those rents rather than having a different account from each one. Just makes sense, I suppose, for them to be able to see their total profits in one place. As we move towards the 16th century, we see a major surge in the production of surveys at this time, and it can probably be put down to the dissolution of the monasteries. I've not talked too much about manor ownership, just because it's another massive topic. If it's something that you're interested in, the Victoria County histories are a really good place to start. They often detail the history of manors for each individual county. Some counties will also have a historian who's done a lot of research into that area. It's something that I would contact your local county archive about if it's something you're interested in. Also, a lot of research was done into the manors during the Manorial Documents Register project, So it may be that the county archive will be able to help you if you're interested in the history of your own manor. But basically, some manors over history were held by monasteries and churches. A lot of this was gifted. Obviously, at the point of the dissolution of the monasteries, that land needed to be redistributed. Sorry. So you see that at this point, lots of different classes of people are buying land, and that can include people with commercial backgrounds. So they're much more interested in seeing the profits of the manor. And that's where we start to see a big surge in the production of surveys. And we see that surveys become much longer, more detailed, and as I say, much more common. So we find a bit more of a formula, 3 types of information usually contained on surveys around this time. You get description of the boundaries of the manor, which I'll go into in a moment. Presentment by the jury of survey relating to the customs of the manor, so you can learn a little bit about the customs of the manor. And a rent roll of all the tenants of the manor, so a list of the tenants who held land, details of the tenants' land, rent they paid, and so on. So information on these later surveys, similarly to what I mentioned earlier on, but maybe a little bit more detail. So means by which the land was inherited, provision for widows, entry fines and heriates, again, so we see that term coming up. Frequency of court meetings, required officials, and as I mentioned earlier on, rights of the lord. So what were his rights to fishing, hunting, profits from treasure, exploitation of ores, existence of common land and privileges, entitlement of tenants to take timber. So there's just so much information that we can gain from these. They really are very information rich surveys in general, but certainly 16th century onwards if we are starting with those later ones and working back. And I've got a really nice example on the left. This is actually just part of a survey. It's a part relating to the survey of the domain land of the Manor of Craster. So John Craster, Esquire, was lord of the manor there. And as we can see, just about halfway down, we've got the name Craster, and then all of the various different locations down the side held within his domain land. So going from the top, the hall and gardens within Towngate, to the bottom, that part between the runner and haven at the bottom there. To the right, we've got the measurements of the land as well. So acres, roods and perches, and at the bottom, you've got your total there as well. So even in that just very small section, we have a really clear understanding of the land which the lord was holding, their domain lands, and even the size and shape of each section. And that's just one very small part. You may also see parliamentary surveys coming up. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on these, but they're just worth bearing in mind. They can be quite a nice one to look at if you're early in your research, because they're entirely in English and they're very formulaic. Basically, these surveys came about following the Commonwealth. So as I mentioned at the beginning, land was held of the king. So when we get the Commonwealth, this land could then be sold on. So you see surveyors following a model survey, producing 2 copies, one for the Surveyor General and one for trustees, who are basically there to try and sell the land to settle arrears of army pay. So they were created mostly for valuation, so that's where they sort of focus, but you do still get tenant names and rents. Not massively common, but you do see them, so it's just worth bearing in mind. Right, maps and boundaries. So I mentioned a moment ago boundaries that are often included on later surveys. When I talk about a boundary, that can also be referred to as a perambulation, or a perambulation of the bounds, which might give you a bit more of an idea of what we're talking about here. Effectively, they were a sort of walk around the edges of the manor, where people highlighted the boundaries of that manor. They can be quite tricky to sort of work out the dimensions of the manor from now. So that was probably not the best way of putting that. But they're often marked by rivers, brooks, outcrops of rock, trees and roads. So especially if your manor now exists in a place that's been quite built up, it might be quite hard to work out where those boundaries were. Maybe because they've been built over, maybe because the natural features have moved. But they can still be, I think, very interesting documents. In a sense of what we can pull, we can see the parish names sometimes. You may be able to work out those boundaries if you're very familiar with an area, or at least sort of vaguely follow the perambulation that they did. It could be quite interesting. But really they're there to define the boundaries of the manor, ensure no encroachments were made by lords or tenants of adjoining manors, so they're not trying to sneak in and move those boundaries, and checking that none of the features that marked the edges of the boundaries have been moved or removed. So that, I mean, that could be malicious, it could be somebody moving one, but bear in mind, you know, it could be something like a storm has knocked over one of the trees or something. So it's just making sure that those early boundaries are as they should be. And this is from the example before. I've just zoomed in because obviously it's quite zoomed out. And we can see an example here of a perambulation. So you can see at the top, the second day's riding of the boundaries of the said manor of Blanchland on Thursday, the first day of August, 1793. So it's a 1793 document. And I just love this. You then get the list of the individuals who are involved in the first day. And I think this is rather nice. You can have a look at the different ages of those individuals as well. So we don't just get the names, we get the ages. And I did have a bit of time to look through this earlier, so I found that the youngest person involved was 9 years old and the oldest was 67. So it's, in that sense, I think that's quite interesting. Again, you can get some really good detail, you know, not just about the individuals involved, but maybe about the sort of format of the town, how things were run in the manor. And it seems like this is something that everyone was involved in. Just below the names, you can also then see the beginning of the perambulation. I'm conscious of time, but we begin the further perambulation of the boundaries of the said manor of Blanchland about 9 o'clock in the morning of Thursday, the first day of August, 1793 at Stonyburn. And then you see that they proceed to talk you through the different locations that they've walked around, which is rather nice. So we can see slightly later document, nice clear hand. You can pull a lot of information from this. When we start to talk about manorial maps, bear in mind that if we're talking about earlier manorial maps, that may be almost more of a drawing than what we imagine as a modern map. And this is a really good opportunity for me to highlight a future resource because she has a really nice example of one of these maps on the front. So this is Using Manorial Records by Mary Ellis. This is pretty much the book I'd direct you to if you're interested in learning a little bit more about different types of manorial records. So that's just a side note. But you can see on the front there, this example of quite an early manorial map. There's no scale. It's more of a drawing, but you can still get an idea of the shape of the land, and sort of an idea of how that land was used. Usually you find that early maps were created in relation to some kind of a dispute. So there's usually a reason for these maps. So you're not going to find them extensively, certainly not from the 16th century. And they may not be a massively clear view of the manor and the manor shape. They'll give you an idea, and they can be really interesting and rather nice, sometimes rather detailed. They do become more common, maps after the 17th century, but do bear in mind that they're still not extensive. From this point, they tend to be measured into scale, and you can get a bit more information from them. So manor boundaries, type of land, use of the land, agriculture, name of the tenants. There's quite a nice example on the left from 1792. And you'll see the names of the tenants written in each of the sections of the land, and then the acreage underneath. Sometimes you find that the map will be numbered and you'll get a list of the tenants and acres to the side of the map, but you may get a separate booklet with those listed. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. But often, and if you're lucky, it's all on one map. And as you can see, it's much, much clearer from this point. But please bear in mind, it's not extensive. So I can't guarantee you'll find one for your manor, but they're worth looking out for. They can be nice, just nice to pore over, even if you're not particularly interested with a set manor. Right, I'm going to now talk you through a little bit of the manor court, because obviously I've mentioned that that's really the defining part of the manor. So the remainder of the time we'll be talking through the court and court records. Many court records follow an established pattern and are standardized, so they can be quite nice documents to start out with. Again, if you start at the later documents and work back, you should be able to still follow that sort of formula as you go through. There are two main types of manor court, and these are the only two I'm going to focus on today, again, because I'm quite limited with time. But that's the court leet and the court baron. And the court leet often comes with a view of frank pledge, and I'll give a very brief introduction to that in a moment. And bear in mind that manorial tenants owed suit to both courts. You'll see the term suit coming up quite a lot when you look into manorial documents. That refers to attendance. So basically they were required to attend both courts. So they had to attend the court leet and the court baron. So the court leet, I'll talk about first. This dealt with criminal affairs and statutory obligations. So you get your slightly more serious crimes coming through the court leet. They're also the court that you tend to see manorial lords, sort of rights that manorial lords have been given or that have been devolved to manorial lords from other courts. So things like the rights to administer a size of bread and ale, for example, might devolve to manorial lords and their courts. And if that's the case, it'll come through the court leet. Again, slightly more serious crimes, it's rarely things like murder and things like that, but if it's anything like that, it would come through the court leet. But usually it's just criminal affairs, statutory obligations coming through there. We also see the elected constables, and I've just put a note here just to bear in mind that there's not always a clear distinction on the documents between court leet and court baron. Often they're both included on one roll. And the example I've given you here, which unfortunately I can't see the top of, I don't know if you can see that too. Oh, I can move this, there we go. So the example I've given you here, again, so this is secretary hand. I think it's quite a clear hand. Again, I'm sorry if I'm being unfair there, but I think with a little bit of practice, this wouldn't be too hard to access. On the top left-hand side, we've got the name of the manor, so the manor of Alnwick Grange, with the members in the county of Northumberland. And then if we just look at the first couple of lines together, the Great Court or Head Court, Court Leet, in view of Frank Pledge, and together with the Court Baron of Major Allgood and Abraham Dixon, gentleman lord of these manors, holden there this 20th day of May in the year of our Lord 1736, before William Cuthbert Esquire, learned steward of the same court. So you can see just in that very small section, we've had the name of the manor. We know that we're looking at the court leet and the court baron on this document. And also rather nicely at the bottom there, you can see that it was held before the steward. So if you remember from earlier on when I mentioned that the steward would hold the court, we also got the name of the steward in there. We're now not going to move. Okay, the panic there that it wasn't going to move on with the slides. So again, I'm not going to focus too much on view of Frank Pledge, but we do sometimes see this appearing with the court leet. So this is a twice yearly inspection by the sheriff of the county as part of a system of tithings. So basically it's a pledge by a group of 10 freemen who are mutually responsible for good behaviour. A one tithing man would attend the sheriff's court usually to represent these free men, and sort of state that good behaviour. And this may be devolved to the lord of the manor. So you remember I mentioned before that some things may be devolved to the manorial court as opposed to those higher courts like the sheriff's court. And in that case, it would go through the court leet. If that happens, the lord could then impose the fines. So that's why it's just worth noting that it's there. But do bear in mind that the significance of this sort of pledge mostly ended after 1500, and it tends to refer more to additional judicial rights held by the court. Again, I'll highlight some books at the end which should help you if you want to look into that a little bit more. But there's a lot of documents to cover, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. I'll talk a little bit now about the court baron. This one's integral to the manor. And in terms of thinking about the customs of the manor, this one's a little bit more central. So the role of the court baron is to administer the regulations set down as the customs of the manor and to deal with offences against it. So if you remember I mentioned before, the sort of defining feature of a manor would be the manor court, and that's because of those customs and administration that they were allowed to bring about. This court monitored that, the court baron. The frequency of the court is also governed by those customs. So it could be fortnightly, it could be monthly. We tend to see on this things like debts, trespass, small tenant disputes. These disputes would be for fines under 40 shillings. So if you think about the court leet, much more serious offences here, we're looking under 40 shillings. Debt, defamation, and it's just worth bearing in mind that anyone can bring anyone up on court baron documents on the court rolls or the court books. So you may find that in one presentment, I'll talk about presentments a bit more in a moment, but on one presentment you might have A accusing B of something, and the next one B could be accusing A, and then also accusing C, D, and E. So they can be quite petty, and we can see quite a lot of people bringing each other up, regardless of position and rank as well. It's just worth bearing in mind. So I've got quite a nice example on the left of a court baron. Again, it's the manor of Alnwick Grange. And you can see just to the right of that title, the court baron of Major Allgood gentleman, lord of the said manor, holden there the 20th day of April in the year of our Lord 1749, before Christopher Fawcett, Esquire, learned steward of the same court. And then below there, you can see the names of the jury, and we've got one presentment at the bottom. Again, I'll talk about these in a moment, but you can see it's under 40 shillings. This presentment is there for 39 shillings and 11 pence. And in this case, James Brown is complaining against William Charlton in a plea of taking and unjustly detaining the cattle of him, the said James Brown, to his damage. Basically, he's nicked his cattle. So he's getting quite a nasty charge there, actually. That's quite close to the top, charge of 40 shillings. But you can see from that, oh, it doesn't want to, every time I move that thing, it doesn't want to move. There we go. You can see from that document alone, again, this is just the first section, the wealth of information we can get even from this little bit. So we've got the name of the manor, we've got the lord, we've got the steward, we've got the names of the jury, and we're starting to see some of those complaints. And you can see some themes coming through as well, which is quite interesting depending on where you are in the country. You may find that a lot of the presentments relate to the location. So when I was working on the manorial documents register for Cheshire, I found that a lot of the complaints were to do with drainage and people not correctly draining their land. So there's a lot of that sort of focus, and actually quite similarly in Lincolnshire. So you may find that there are some themes that relate to the land that you're actually looking at. You tend to find in the court baron, you may find precepts attached to those. So that's where the steward has asked the bailiff to tell people that there's a court, because obviously they had to attend. So on that, you'll get the type of the court, the time, the place. Below that, we've already mentioned this, name of the manor, date, lord, steward's name. Cut off from this, but you will also get details of the tenants not in attendance. I mentioned assoyns at the beginning. I'm not sure if you remember that, but basically they could pay a small fee to not attend. So I'll mention if they've done that. If they don't pay that, they then have to pay an amercement, which is a larger fine. So basically, if they don't show up and don't tell anyone they're not coming, they're fined much further. You then get the jurors' names and then the presentments. So these are the various matters that the jury puts forward, which are to be dealt with at court. And obviously I've already talked you through one. But basically these are usually minor disputes. They can be quite petty. We get damages, neglects to land, abuses to common land. So too many livestock, trying to enclose common land, so maybe encroaching. They could result in fines or amercements. You may also find in the presentments or during the manor courts that regulations are restated. Again, there can be, this can sort of depend on what county you're in as to how these are referred, but you may see them known as pains, ordinances, bylaws, different terms may appear. So the presentments can be very interesting as well. It depends on the sort of research you're doing, but you can gain a really good understanding of the manor and how things are run. So the examples on the left, these are for Wooler, and this is quite interesting. I'm going to put myself under pressure now and read the top one, but we present James Steward of Wooler for laying and placing 15 tar barrels in the King's Highway in the town of Wooler, commonly called the King's Street, of the town of Wooler, to the great annoyance of all His Majesty's liege subjects, for which we fine him 10 shillings. So basically you can see basically he's blocking the road, so he's been charged. Sometimes you see things like, you know, so-and-so's sheep have escaped and eaten all of my crops. You know, you get a good mix of the different types of presentment. They can be really interesting. So associated with the courts, so in court books, or you may find these separately. You can also find surrenders and admissions. So any legal action regarding customary tenants had to be pursued through the manor courts. New tenants could only take possession of customary land through the process of surrender and admission. So basically, they have to go to the court. The jury presents the death of the tenants so that the heriots can be collected, so the lord can get their best beast or whatever it is. And then the heirs come forward and they're admitted. So surrenders and admissions, surrenders and admittances, that's what this refers to. An example on the left, which I know is quite far away, but it was more to give you an idea of the different sort of shapes of the documents you may get, is a very large volume of surrenders and admissions. By the 18th century, you can also find that tenants could raise loans on their land as mortgages. Court rolls may detail these, referring to them as conditional surrenders. So that's another term to bear in mind. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to shuffle through these. Other sorts of court records you could find. could include minutes. When we talk about those, it's not that dissimilar from how we think of minutes today. So details of court transactions. You may find a street rolls, so that's records, and that records details of amercements or fines imposed by the courts. So if you remember, I talked about amercements before. They simply list the names of the tenants amerced with brief details of the amount and the offences. So what are the charges, why are they being charged? You may also get suit rolls, so that's a list of the tenants who owed suit. We've got a nice example of a suit roll to the left. You should be able to see that just at the top, about an inch or so in the suit roll of the freeholders, copy holders, etc. So again, we've got those terms coming forward of the different tenants. So on this suit roll, you can see all of the named individuals, the dates of those courts, and then you can see if they attended or not. If you look down towards John Forster, he's got quite a few A's next to his names. I think he's been immersed quite a bit. I don't think he's been attending his court. But again, you can get a lot of information even from what appears to be just a short list of people attending the court or not. You've got the names of the steward, the lord, the date of the record, some locations, some names of tenants. And you may also see call books. So these also list the tenants who owed suit, but you find that these are used also more as a register as well. Other documents, again, I'll just brush over this. You may find enfranchisements. So that's documents which detail the conversion of freehold land to copyhold. So they move between freehold and copyhold. Lords or tenants could initiate this, but both had to agree. One couldn't just do it without the permission of the other. And these record the county, manor, date, tenant's name, and evidence of title. And again, I don't have much time to go through it, but just be aware that that's a document, and I'll show you where you can look to find more information on those if you are interested in a moment. Just before I do that, before I highlight some sources, I just wanted to rather excitedly talk to you about the project that I've just started at Northumberland Archives. The archives have been granted a fund of £73,100 by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And this is for a project that will promote the use of Northumberland manors and their records. So basically the records relating to Northumberland manors. And basically you can see it as almost a next step to that MDR project. So we've got the Manorial Documents Register, we've highlighted all of these documents, we've highlighted where we can find them. Now we're going to show you how you can use them. So we're going to work with 6 volunteer groups at least across the county to transcribe some documents or to gain some information from these documents. We'll be providing for those groups skills in paleography and transcription. We'll also be working with some PhD placement students who will help with the forming of these volunteer groups and the work, help deal with the work that comes from this and help us to decide how we're going to work with this. Some of this information will also then be made available online into an online resource. We'll create a website, a web page, which will then be useful to help you with your future research into Northumbrian manors and their records. And as I say, it's a valuable resource and next step. So it's called the Everyday Life in a Northumbrian Manor project. And this is just to make sure that you're aware that it's going on. We're still in those early stages. I'm only just about in my 2nd month now, so we're still at that early point. But we are moving forward with the project. Just keep your eyes out for any volunteer opportunities that may appear over the next, it's 2.5 years, the project, so they may appear throughout. Any future talks and workshops, I'd love to see you. And then maybe some work with schools around the county, which will be occurring, so if you can see anything to do with that, blogs and outreach, and then eventually the completed website. So again, that may be towards the end of that 2.5 years, but just keep your eyes out. If you are specifically interested in Northumbrian manors, something is coming. Otherwise, hopefully it'll be useful for anyone researching manors anyway. So just to finally end the talk, because I'm conscious of the time, I'll just highlight some resources you can go to try and look a little bit more into these documents that I have sort of had to fly over today. So this is the Cumbrian Manorial Records website. This is a brilliant resource. Obviously, it does relate to Cumbrian manorial records. But as I've mentioned, there's quite a bit of standardization across the country. So looking into these records should help you regardless of the county that you're involved in. And they do tend to mention when certain terms refer only to that county. You can see down the left-hand side, there's a gallery, and that includes all of these different records, the ones where I haven't been able to include an image. You can find an image and example there. The one on the screen is a Reeves account. Those of you that were listening will remember me talking about the Reeves as the Manor official. So there's an example of that there on the screen, and you can see they have a transcript. They also go on to provide some details at the bottom as well, some notes. So that's a really good starting resource. Again, it's a free online resource. The University of Nottingham, their manuscripts and special collections do the same. They also have some quite nice sites to do with conversions, which you can see down the left-hand side. So I talked a little bit about acres, roods and perches earlier. If you want to look into that sort of conversion to modern measurements, you can find that on here. But their introduction to manorial records, again, they have images. It's a very useful resource, and I'll talk you through any of the documents that I've had to fly over today. Also just included some books here. There are loads. There's a massive amount of books that can be quite useful. So I've just included the ones that I use, but you know, there's many more. So I've mentioned Mary Ellis. This is a different version of the book. Cover of the book is the same book, but different cover. Using manorial records, very good if you're just looking into wanting to learn a bit more about the records themselves. Paul Harvey's Manorial Records on the top right. Brilliant introduction to manors and their records. So that gets a little bit more of the history of the manors in there. Also a very good resource. And the English Manor, if you're just interested in the history of manors, Mark Bailey, here's the English Manor, very good resource there. Bottom right, Manorial Records by Dennis Stewart includes a lot of transcripts. So if you want to practice your paleography and see quite a few examples, that's a really good resource. I've highlighted middle and left, so lower, middle and left. Dorset Manorial documents, I really like that guide. Obviously it relates to Dorset Manorial. It might be worth having a look to see if your county has their own guide. There's also the Berwick, Tweedmouth and Spittal one, which I have to include obviously because of where I'm at, and that has a lovely little section as well about manorial records. So it might be worth just having a look. There's also one for Welsh Manors by Helen Watt that I've not included on here. So if you're joining us from Wales, you haven't been forgotten. There is a book by Helen Watt, The Welsh Manor, that you can access as well. Okay, I do have a list of resources, so just feel free to let me know if you'd like that. I'm sure you can contact me. My contact is there as well. So there's the contact for the volunteering. If you're interested in that, feel free to get in touch there. Any other queries, you've got my email address there as well. If we don't have time to answer a lot of questions today, because I've overrun a little bit, I apologise. And that's me done. So we have any questions? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Beth. That was a fascinating talk, and you had an awful lot to fit in there in the time. But hopefully for everyone, it's given them a better idea of manorial records and what they can find in them, and also remove that fear for them. So I've got a couple of questions for you if you want to, if you're happy to answer them. I don't think we'll get through them all, but I'll make a start. One question from Ben is, was there much regional variety with the manorial system? So, for example, would manorial documents in Northumberland look very different from contemporary documents in southern England, or would they be the same?
There's not a massive amount of difference. There is quite a bit of formulaic elements to the documents, but obviously each county has their own quirks. So my main advice with that is that if you do look at the general resources that I've given you, you should be fine to then access the documents, and you will find that there's not a massive amount of difference. But that said, they really do have their own quirks. So I talked about when I started at Northumberland, there were quite a few call books, which I'd noticed, which I hadn't found quite as many of in the other counties that I'd worked at. So really, your differences can go down to different manors, you know, so it could be on a much smaller scale. I wouldn't say that there's enough of a massive difference that you'd see a Northumberland document as being completely different from one from a different part of the country. But I'm not going to say with any confidence that there won't be some differences, because they do all have their own quirks. But yeah, certainly there's some formulaic elements there across the board.
Thank you. Question from Joe, was copyhold tenure less common in counties which were part of the Danelaw, such as Leicestershire?
That one I'm not sure about, I'm afraid. That's a bit specific to me. I'm not sure how to put that in. It might be one that you could contact Leicestershire and Rutland Archives. They did do their MDR project around the same time that I did the Cheshire one. So they have completed that, so they may be able to point you to some history there. That's not something I myself have researched into, so I don't feel confident giving you a strong answer there, I'm afraid.
Right, that's fine. You're honest, so that's the main thing. A question from Philip. In the medieval period, could a tenant be a female?
Oh, yeah. Well, you do have female tenants coming up, certainly. Yes. I don't know how to extend on that. Yeah, you do get female tenants. You do get female ladies of the manor as well. That's not, I'm not sure how common we're talking, but I mean, you do get female tenants. I'd certainly say they do appear. Again, that it might vary across the country and depending on your county, but certainly I wouldn't be surprised if you found some female tenants. Maybe the males are more likely to be listed, but you are going to get female tenants as well. Yeah.
Right. And another question from Jill, possibly, would many tenants be able to read, or is that something that we just can't work out?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of sort of access to learning and reading, depending on the dates we're working with, it's not a massively common thing being able to read across the board with tenants. I suppose it would depend on the individual tenants, but no, I wouldn't say that's overly common. You've got to think about printed books and how people will be learning to read. It's quite a bit more common. Obviously, we've got Bibles and books like that, depending on what area of the medieval we're looking at. But certainly, I wouldn't say it was common that tenants could read, but there's always variety again. But yeah, not overly common. But yeah, we can't say for sure that they couldn't all, some of them couldn't, but certainly not all of them, no.
Right, and a question from Sharon. I have heard of ministers' accounts. Are these a manorial account? And if so, who would have been responsible for them and what were they for?
Right, you can get ministers' accounts. I believe they can be manorial. I'm sure I found some manorial ministers' accounts taken by the minister. I'm just going to have a quick look now and see if Cumbrian Manorial have a section on that, because I feel like they might. And that might be a nice place to direct you to. But yes, certainly you can find ministers' accounts appearing with Manor records. Let me see if I can find those. Sorry, this isn't going to be very interesting for you, overlooking me. Yeah, I mean, yeah, certainly, sorry, I don't want to spend a lot of time with it, but yes, is the short answer. You can find those taken by the minister. It's something that it may just be worth having a look through some of those resources and seeing if you can find a bit more information on those, because it might take me a little while to explain that, if that's okay.
Right, and I think we've just got time for one more question from Michael, who says, I'm working with court rolls from the 1200s. In one of these, which is a Holy Latin document, there's suddenly a page entirely in English. Is this unusual, and why would it happen? Have you come across anything like that?
Not from that date. I don't know if that's something you've come across, Linda. You do occasionally see English coming into documents, but not that early. I'm sorry, no, that's not something I've come across.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I haven't seen it that early, because you often get then, say, in later documents, and then it will often put, say, Anglica, meaning in English or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think that's very unusual, actually, to find that in a document in the 1200s, because it's definitely more likely to be Latin as the language that's used for communication more than anything else, I would say. Definitely. Yeah. Well, I think we've just about run out of time there. Thank you, Beth, for that. Was a fascinating talk. As I said, you had so much to cover there, and it's really only the tip of the iceberg. You know, hopefully you can come back and give us another talk later on, once we're a bit further into the project.
Certainly. Yeah.
We do hope that you've all enjoyed the talk tonight, and will come along to our new series of talks, which is online talks, which is starting in September, and when the theme will be the Lindisfarne Gospels, because obviously they're coming back to the region then. So look out for more information on this on our social media streams. So thank you all again for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.